One of the major jobs of congregations, and I think also ministers, is to speak to the issues of the day. It's one of my favorite parts, and congregations should be relevant and engaged not only with the spiritual side of life, but also with the very real developments happening out in the world. After the 2016 election, for example, we talked here a lot about disappointment. But we also talked about hope and resiliency and resistance. If we hadn't, we would have been failing our obligation to speak to our moment in history and what was on one another's hearts and minds. Every moment in time is distinct and unique. I'm constantly struck just how different the national and cultural landscape feel, even a few months apart. Despite how often it feels like we live fragmented lives, despite our diversity of thought and background and belief, we do share a common life together. What's striking to me in the past few months is how different the national conversation has been since the 2018 midterm elections, especially for the left, where a majority of folks here at Fourth Universalist reside. The issues have been different. The emotions have been different. The tensions and conversations within the left have been different. With the election of a Democratic House of Representatives, liberals, for the first time in a while, have a degree of power. And before that, the conversation on the left was very clear. Liberal values were being attacked, and liberals had to band together. It was all hands on deck for an emergency. The formula was pretty simple. The president was bad. All those who resisted him were good. Liberals knew who their friends were, who to support, and who to oppose. But what is so interesting since the midterms is that this equation has gotten a lot more complicated. Because by taking the House of Representatives, the left has exposed divisions within itself that previously it had been able to ignore. The old simple equation isn't as simple anymore. We see it playing out in Congress with fights there. We see it playing out in the presidential primary. A widening gap, to use conventional and imperfect language, between those who consider themselves moderates and those who are more radical. So today I want to talk about that tension and what it means for us as people with strong values, and also as people who are religious liberals and Unitarian Universalists. I should begin by saying that I wade into these waters with some trepidation. It's actually pretty easy for me to come up on Sundays and draw the line between the president's policies and our values. No one's ever complained to me about a sermon condemning our president. No one's ever complained about making a point about climate change being real, or about refuting the wall, or detaining kids, or defending the Affordable Care Act. Those are easy sermons to give. They're comfortable. Sometimes it's literally preaching to the choir. But it's trickier to talk about things where there's actually some diversity of belief, where some of us might actually disagree with each other. And with the growing tension between moderates and radicals, I suspect there is a difference of opinion within this group. I suspect that because some of you have told me that. For me, the divide on the left is embodied probably in its clearest, most clear form by the public's reaction to the document called the Green New Deal. It is a sweeping, not especially detailed document that calls for a radical transformation of our society to save our planet from climate change. And it doesn't just stop with the traditional green stuff. It touches on really every single issue facing American society today. Workers' rights, education, jobs, healthcare. If people are talking about it, chances are it's somewhere in there. It promises to make the United States a zero-emission country within a short 10 years. Now, the reaction from the right has been predictable. It's a socialist fantasy, unrealistic, bad policy, impossible, a product of young and idealistic new lawmakers who don't understand how things work. But what's more interesting, I think, is what it stirred up on the left. Probably more than any other issue, it has brought to light the clear contrast between liberal moderates and liberal radicals. Again, imperfect language. Nowhere was this more clear, I think, than a few weeks ago in an exchange between the California Senator Dianne Feinstein when she was visited by a group of children and youth several weeks ago. The group that was visiting her was part of a group called the Sunrise Movement that works to engage young people to combat climate change, and they asked the senator to explain her lack of support for the Green New Deal. In a now infamous recording, she defends her lack of support, essentially making two arguments. One, there's, quote, no way to pay for it, and two, that the resolution will not pass the Senate. The exchange quickly became combative. The New York Times called it testy. The kids and the young adult chaperones who were there responded by not accepting the senator's explanation and instead rebutted it. They pointed out, quote, we have tons of money for the military, and that they and not she would have to live with the consequences of the Senate's inaction. The senator did not take kindly to being challenged in this way. She touted her recent and resounding election, their 25 years of experience in the Senate, the fact that she had grandchildren who would be alive, and that she did not represent them because they had not voted for them, her because they were kids. The senator was clearly frustrated, and the kids and the chaperones were clearly frustrated too. If you haven't watched this video, the full video of this exchange, I would encourage you to do so. It's fascinating, it's upsetting. It's these issues playing out in real time. The Sunrise Movement would later call the senator's response condescending. The senator would call it spirited. The exchange was essentially this conflict between moderates and radicals, live streamed. But I'm curious about what was actually going on there and what we're supposed to make of this divide that is so present right now on the left. What are the differences between these two groups, not just in that video, but more generally, and even within our congregation and the left more generally? One view suggests that moderates are essentially pragmatists, where radicals are idealists. This idea holds that moderates and radicals actually agree on most things, more or less on the goals of where we should go, but that moderates are more politically astute. They're astute enough to realize what is possible and what is not. That was essentially Feinstein's argument. The Green Deal will not pass the Senate, which is objectively true. It will not. And there is no money anyway, and so it makes no sense to support an impossible piece of legislation. If moderates are pragmatists and they believe that in theory, the Green New Deal is good, and they would support it, but being so forward about it hurts the cause. It threatens a backlash and ultimately undermines the hope for progress that they have. Now, by temperament, I'm more of a pragmatist myself. I lean towards practical effectiveness and efficiency over flowery, flashy things that don't actually get the job done. And there is good reason, I think, to fear. For example, that nominating a radical for president might make that person harder to elect. The pragmatist might vote for a more centralist candidate for electability reasons, rather than someone they might more fully agree with, because in the long run, that's what's best for the cause. The view of moderates essentially being pragmatists is a strong one. It's enticing, and it can be true at times. But I think it ignores very real differences as well. Some of these differences are ideological. Many moderate liberals really do not want Medicare for all. Many do not actually believe that we should abolish billionaires or go back to a 70% marginal tax rate on the wealthy, or offer reparations for the descendants of slaves. Many don't believe that the Green New Deal would be good, even if it were politically feasible. But even with these ideological differences, even with the differences in tactics, pragmatists versus idealists, putting all that aside, I think the best way of understanding the tension between true moderates and true radicals is by understanding their relationships with the status quo and what counts as an emergency. It starts by understanding each group's motivation and why they hold the beliefs they do. Radicals, for example, are often radicals because they feel like they don't have any other choice. They are directly impacted by the issues that they are fighting for. Some of them are radicals because their lives depend on it. Thus, trans people push for acceptance because they are targets for violence and discrimination in very real ways. People of color are often radicals because they fight for an overhaul of the criminal justice system and the police, because if they don't, they or people they know might be killed. This contrasts with moderates, for who the status quo is often viewed as stable, as good enough, as acceptable given the situation. Change might be fine. It might be good, but not too fast, because change could also be bad. For radicals, the status quo feels like an emergency. They don't fight for a cause because they want to often, but because they have to. Because the status quo is profoundly painful, frightening, and damaging. There can be great privilege in moderation. We see this with issues of police violence, with healthcare, with access to clean water. If well-meaning people with power suddenly feared being shot by police, or losing their healthcare, or drinking poisoned water like in Flint, I have no doubt that that would be perceived as an emergency. I certainly would. It's terrifying to think of that actually being my life. But when other people who are not me have those experiences, how often are they told that we just don't have the money or the resources or the time? How often are they told to be patient, or that's just how things are? They are told that we live in an imperfect world and that change can only happen so fast. Or perhaps worse, they are just ignored and looked past because the privileged don't really have to pay attention. It's easy to forget or ignore or just click on to the next page on the website. And we are all guilty of that sometimes. For many moderates, especially those with privilege, the challenge is that real change might actually mean changing. It might mean paying more in taxes or being forced to see yourself as part of the problem. Change means instability and uncertainty, and if you are used to being comfortable and in control, that is scary and new. Because in America, privilege buys you the opportunity for peace of mind and to be removed from change. You don't have to worry about it if you are comfortable. For radicals, the status quo is scary enough and broken enough that the risk of change is a risk you have to take. With the kids in the senator's office, if we believe what scientists are telling us, the status quo for climate is going to be catastrophic. It's hard to imagine the scale of the impending disaster. It scares me. It scared the kids in the video, clearly. I have friends who won't have children because they are so afraid of what the future holds. And I don't think they're being unreasonable. When those same scientists tell us that we only have 12 years before we seal our fate, the status quo becomes intolerable. That's why the Green New Deal attempts to eliminate emissions in 10. In their minds, we have no other choice. The risk of not being radical, of not overturning the system, is far too great. Despite all of this, radicals are not pessimists. They may see the warts of the world and all the problems, but they haven't given up, which is why they believe that things can get better, and they propose such things like the Green New Deal. They think we can do it if we have the will and conviction. They ask quite reasonably questions that we all should be asking, like, why can't we live in a country where everyone has health care that is good? Why can't we live in a country where everyone gets paid a living wage? Why can't we have affordable housing? And why does so much money go to corporations in the 1% and the military, and then we're told that we don't have enough money for everything else? Why can other countries in the developed world pay for all the things, and we can't? Radicals are here to help redefine what is possible and what should be possible. They force us to stop and think and ask why we care about some things and not others, why we accept some things as reasonable and other things as impossible. As Unitarian Universalists, our principles are clear on this too. There is no principle about being patient about suffering or being satisfied with good enough. There is no principle that defends the right of a few people to hold a majority of the wealth when others can barely feed their children. Instead, our principles are clear. We must honor the inherent worth and dignity of all, not just all who can afford it. We affirm the justice, equity, and compassion for all. We respect the interdependent web of all existence. These are fundamentally radical principles. They are fitting of a tradition of ours that has pushed the boundaries of society for generations. Whether it was going against England in establishing this democracy and the right of people to choose their government in 1776, to abolishing slavery, to fighting for women's suffrage, to marriage equality. When we look on the heroes of Unitarian Universalists' past, we don't remember those who said, just wait a little longer. We remember the radicals, those people who fought those things, who were uncompromising. Being Unitarian Universalists means being those things. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be pragmatic or thoughtful or strategic, but it does mean that if we are feeling uncomfortable with the idea of change, of radical change, of things moving too fast, our UU principles insist that we ask why. Is it because we're afraid of the change that it might bring, or of the unknown? Is it because we ourselves might be asked to change or give something up? Is it because that we're not actually experiencing the suffering ourselves, or haven't really intuited deep in our hearts that other people, just as real as us, are suffering? We have to remember that no matter who we are or how we identify, that Unitarian Universalist values insist that we hold several things to be true. That unless the status quo serves us all, it is not good enough. That emergency for some people needs to be an emergency for all people. That the problems that we face are great enough, urgent enough, that we must be willing to make real and sometimes drastic changes to solve them before it is too late, before more people suffer and are in pain. Unless you can say that all of this is good enough, the pain of so many is within acceptable parameters, And the only moral response is to work for change, is to be bold, think big, and take risks. Call yourself a moderate or a radical or even a conservative. But don't ignore the pain that is out there in this world and that is real. Because the crisis of our world cannot wait. There is too much pain and suffering out there. There is too much on the horizon that will cause so much damage. Maybe that is radical, but maybe it's not. To me, it's just Unitarian Universalism, common sense, basic decency, and people just trying to survive. May it be so, and amen.